Chapter 22, The New Era, discusses the social, political, and economic climate of the 1920s. First, we will begin with technology and economic growth, where the nation's manufacturing output rose by more than 60% during the decade. The economic boom was a result of many factors. The automobile industry became one of the most important industries in the nation and stimulated growth in many related industries as well, where auto owners purchased productions of steel, rubber, glass, etc., fueling a boom in the construction industry. Radio began to make a popular technology before commercial broadcasting began in 1920. Before, radio communication would broadcast little besides pulses, so they would communicate through Morse code. Then Canadian scientist Reginald Fessenden made it possible to transmit speech and music. Also, train became faster and more efficient as well with the development of the diesel electric engine. Then, early computers started taking place, where by 1930s, researchers at MIT led by Vannevar Bush created the first analog computer, which was capable of performing a variety of complicated tasks. A few years later, Howard Aiken built a more complex computer with memory. Then genetic research had begun in Austria through the work of Gregor Mendel, who performed experiments on the hybridization of vegetables in the garden of a monastery. Then Thomas Hunt Morgan of Columbia University did experiments of fruit flies and revealed how genes could be transmitted together, where Mendel's belief that they could only be transferred separately. Now we move on to the economic organization, where large sectors of the American business were accelerating their drive toward national organization and consolidation. So an example is General Motors, which was by 1920, they were the largest automobile manufacturer and the founder. So William Durant, he had expanded the company dramatically but had never replaced his management style. Then the company fell to Alfred Sloan, who created a modern administrative system with an efficient divisional organization. Then, some industries less susceptible to domination by a few great corporations attempted to stabilize themselves not through consolidation but through corporation. So an example is the trade association, where it is a national organization created by various members of an industry to encourage coordination in production and marketing techniques. As for labor in the new era, the remarkable economic growth was accompanied by a continuing increasing maldistribution of wealth and purchasing power. So 2/3 of Americans lived as the minimum comfort level, as for half of those were categorized in the level of subsistence and poverty. So many enjoyed greatly improved working conditions and other benefits, where some employers in the 1920s adopted paternalistic techniques that came to be known as welfare capitalism. So for a few examples was that Henry Ford, he shortened the work week and instituted paid vacations, and in the end, American workers in the 1920s remained a relatively impoverished and powerless group. Unemployment was lower in the 1920s than it had been in the previous 2 decades. The AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor, was workers who were organized on the basis of particular skills. Now moving on to women and minorities in the workforce. The workforce consisted of women who were concentrated on pink-collar jobs, which was low-paying service occupations with many of the same problems as manufacturing employment. So a large number of women worked as secretaries, sales clerks, telephone operators, when the 500,000 African Americans who had migrated from rural South to the cities. The AFL often worked actively to include blacks from their trade and organizations. They did jobs such as being janitors, dishwashers, etc. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, founded in 1925 and led for years by Philip Randolph, was led by an African American and representing a virtually all-black workforce. In the West and Southwest, ranks of unskilled workers included a large amount of Asians and Hispanics. So Japanese immigrants increasingly took place of the Chinese and worked on railroads, construction sites, and most Japanese escaped the ranks of being unskilled by opening their own businesses or truck farmers. Mexican immigrants also formed a major part of unskilled workforce throughout the Southwest and California. 500,000 Mexicans entered the U.S. in the 1920s, increasing the Mexican population to over 1 million. Now we're moving on to agriculture, technology, and the plight of the farmer. American agriculture in the 1920s was embracing new technologies for increasing production. For example, the number of tractors on American farms began to be powered by internal combustion engines rather than steam engines in the past, resulting to produce more crops with fewer workers. These new technologies greatly increased agricultural productivity, but the demand for agricultural goods were not rising as fast as production. It was a decline in food prices, drop in farmers' income. And then they came up with the idea of parity. Also, in 1928 and 1926, Congress approved a bill requiring parity for grain, cotton, tobacco, and rice, but President Coolidge vetoed it both times. So also, no group was more aware of the emergence of consumerism than the advertising industry. So, for example, J. Walter Thompson, they used different techniques where they sought to identify products with a particular lifestyle to persuade potential consumers that purchasing a product could be personally fulfilling. At this time, movies were becoming popular and a powerful form of mass communication. More than 100 million people saw films in the 1930s. There were also changing ideas of motherhood where the decade saw a redefinition of the idea of motherhood. Many women attempted to compensate by devoting new attention to their roles as wives and companions to develop what became known as companionate marriage. Also, Margaret Sanger, she came up with the birth control devices and movements. She came up with it for working class women, believing that larger families were among the major causes of poverty and distress in poor communities. Birth control devices began to find a large market among middle class women. Women were still pressing for rights. The National Woman's Party, under the leadership of Alice Paul, pressed on its campaign to make the Equal Rights Amendment proposed in 1923 a part of the Constitution. Moving on, the growing secularism of American culture and its expanding emphasis on training and expertise found reflection in the increasingly important role of education in the lives of American youth. So the society realized that a more extended period of training and preparation was necessary before a young person was ready to move into the workplace. Moving on now to the Harlem Renaissance. It took place in Harlem in New York City. It was a new generation of black artists and intellectuals creating a flourishing African American culture widely described as the Harlem Renaissance. There was also a conflict of cultures such as prohibition, where sale and manufacture of alcohol went into effect January 1920, and the middle class and the progressives supported this, and also prohibition did reduce drinking, but it grew violations that made the law almost controversial. Also, too many employers had fought to keep low-pay immigrant workers coming into the country, and Americans started to associate immigration with radicalism. So in 1921, Congress passed an Emergency Immigration Act establishing a system where any country could not exceed 3% of the number of persons of that nationality who had been in the U.S. in 1910. This new law cut immigration from 800,000 to 300,000 in 1 year. As for the government and business, during the 1920s, the federal government was trying to adopt public policy and widely accepted goal at the time, which was helping business and industry operate with maximum efficiency and productivity. Sir Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of Treasury, he devoted himself to working for reductions in taxes, and his administration managed to retire half of the nation's World War I debt. So in the end, Herbert Hoover, who was running for presidency, he became president in 1928, and less than a year in his inauguration, the nation plunged into the severest and most prolonged economic crisis in history, where the new era came crashing down and launched the nation into the Great Depression. In this era, flappers were trending. Some women concluded that in the new era, it was no longer necessary to maintain a rigid Victorian female. Women were able to smoke, drink, wear seductive clothing. The flapper lifestyle impacted the lower class and the working class single woman. As for the American plan, the turmoil in 1919, corporate leaders worked hard to spread the doctrine that unionism was somehow subversive. A crucial element of a democratic capitalism was the protection of the open shop, which no worker was required to join a union. This was titled the American Plan, received the endorsement of the National Association of Manufacturers in 1920, and became a pretext for a harsh campaign of union busting across the country. In 1922, the Justice Department intervened to quell a strike by 400,000 railroad workers, and in 1924, the courts refused protection to members of the United Mine Workers. And as a result of these developments, union membership fell from more than 5 million in 1920 to 3 million in 1929.